Welcome to my channel, C.S. Lewis Spirit. In today's story, we step into a place where silence carries secrets, where light itself questions who it belongs to, and where a single name can vanish from the memory of heaven. Imagine this for a moment. What if one day your soul was not where it was supposed to be? Not in the golden records of heaven, not even in the safe balance of earth, but instead written down in the darker books of another world. What happens when heaven erases you and hell writes you down? Our story begins with Elias, a man who lived a quiet life, never loud enough to draw attention, yet never sinful enough to be condemned. To his neighbors, he was almost invisible, a shadow that drifted through the streets without noise. But one night, when he dreamed, something changed. He saw a staircase made of stars, rising higher than any mountain, and on each step, names were carved in light. He searched for his own name, moving up and down the staircase, but the glow was fading. The letters that once spelled his place in eternity were slowly being erased, stroke by stroke, as though heaven itself had forgotten him. Elias woke up shaken, but he convinced himself it was only a dream. Still, strange things began to follow him in the waking world. Birds turned silent when he walked by. Old friends he had known for years stared at him blankly, as if they had never seen him before. Even in his own house, mirrors showed a reflection that seemed thinner, less complete, like part of him was missing. It was as though reality was quietly closing its doors on him. Then came the moment he could not ignore. One evening, as he sat alone, the sound of a pen scratching across paper echoed in the darkness of his room. There was no hand, no desk, no book, only the sound. And yet he felt it, deep in his chest, as though someone was writing him down. Not in light, not in blessing, but in shadows. That night he whispered, "Who remembers me?" And the silence that followed was heavier than words. The next day, Elias found an old journal tucked beneath the loose floorboard of his house. Its pages were brittle, covered in dust, but one sentence was written clearly, almost as if waiting for him. "The erased are never free. They belong to the ink of the other side." His hands trembled as he read, and he knew this was no coincidence. Something beyond him had already begun to claim what heaven had released. This is where his journey begins. Not in celebration, but in uncertainty, not in glory, but in shadows. What force decides when heaven forgets a name? And why does hell so eagerly write it down? Elias is about to discover that being forgotten by heaven is not the end of a soul. It is only the beginning of something far more dangerous. And as the candlelight flickered across that torn journal, Elias heard footsteps outside his door, footsteps of someone, or something, that had already been waiting for him. Elias tried to convince himself that the sound of the pen in the night was only his mind playing tricks, but the unease followed him like a shadow he couldn't shake. Every step outside felt heavier, as if the world itself was pushing him away. He went to the marketplace where he had always been known by name, yet the shopkeeper squinted at him with the look one gives a stranger. "Have we met before?" the man asked, though Elias had bought bread there for years. The words stung more than he expected. It wasn't just forgetfulness. It was as if his presence was being erased from every memory he had ever touched. That night, Elias sat with the journal again. The ink on the old pages seemed darker than before, as though it had been freshly written. He traced the sentence with his finger. "The erased are never free." He wondered if the footsteps he had heard outside belonged to the one who had written it. But a colder thought entered his mind. What if the footsteps were waiting for him because his name had already been claimed? The conflict inside him grew. Was he fighting heaven's silence, or was he resisting hell's ink? Either way, he was trapped in a struggle that had no clear lines. Elias thought about his family, about faces that should have remembered him, and the sharp ache of realizing they might wake tomorrow with no memory of who he was. To be forgotten was one thing. To be erased was another. The journal's brittle pages turned by themselves, stopping at a blank sheet. For a moment, Elias thought it was empty, but slowly, faint letters began appearing, as if written by an invisible hand. They spelled his name, and underneath it, a single unfinished line. "The ink is not yet dry." Elias could not take his eyes off the words forming on the page. His name, written in a script that wasn't his own, looked alive, as if the letters were breathing. The unfinished line beneath it seemed to wait, hungry, for more. His pulse quickened, and the candle beside him flickered violently, though there was no wind in the room. He felt watched, though the house was locked tight. The silence pressed down heavier than any noise, carrying with it a strange certainty. Something was here with him. He tried to shut the journal, but the pages resisted, fluttering as though unseen fingers held them open. The ink bled across the sheet, curling into shapes, forming not just words but faint outlines of doors, staircases, and shadows reaching upward. Elias realized this was no ordinary book. It wasn't only recording his name, it was opening something. And each word seemed to draw him closer to the moment when his erasure from heaven would be complete. The tension inside him twisted into fear. If heaven had erased him, who was left to defend him now? He thought about the staircase of stars from his dream, about the names carved in light. Perhaps his had already been replaced. Perhaps someone else now stood where he once belonged. The thought hollowed him, but before he could dwell, a sound rose again. The scratching of that same unseen pen, this time louder, faster, urgent. The journal's pages turned rapidly, the ink racing across them, filling lines with words he could not fully read. His candle dimmed, shadows stretched, and from the corner of the room came the distinct sound of footsteps again. Slow, steady, deliberate, moving closer with each breath he took. Elias froze, realizing that whoever had been writing his story was no longer outside. They were already in the room. Elias did not dare to turn toward the sound. Every instinct told him to move, to run, but his body felt locked in place, pinned by a weight heavier than fear itself. The journal trembled on the table, its pages whipping back and forth though no wind touched them. Then, as if pulled by some hidden thread, the candle went out, plunging the room into darkness. Yet the ink on the open page glowed faintly, casting an eerie blue light across the room. That light revealed something Elias could not explain. In the corner, where the footsteps had stopped, a figure began to take shape. Not solid, but a shifting outline, like smoke trying to hold form. Its presence was undeniable, but what shook Elias most was that the figure wasn't unfamiliar. It looked like him. The same height, the same shoulders, even the same tired lines in the face. A perfect shadow of himself, only hollow-eyed and smiling with a calmness that didn't belong to him. The shadow reached toward the journal, and Elias realized with horror that the ink continued writing. Not just his name anymore, but two names. His own, and beneath it, the shadows. Line after line appeared, binding them together as though they were two halves of the same story. Elias's heart pounded as the truth pressed into his mind. He wasn't simply being erased. He was being rewritten. The stakes were no longer about memory or belonging. This was about identity itself. If the shadow was written down, and he was erased, then who would be left walking in the world? Would it be him, or would it be this hollow version, carrying his face but not his soul? The thought clawed at him, and he reached out instinctively to slam the journal shut. But before he could, the shadow moved first, its smoky hand pressing the book flat with impossible strength. The glow intensified, filling the room with a strange light that seemed to burn without fire. Elias felt his chest tighten, as if something was being pulled from him and laid onto the page. In that moment, he understood the cruel twist of his fate. Heaven had erased him not because he was forgotten, but because something else had already claimed his name. And now, hell wasn't just writing him down. It was trying to make his shadow the only version that remained.